Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being part of this virtual event. My name is Walid Hijazi, and I'm a professor of economic analysis and policy at the Rotman School of Management and academic director of Rotman's Business of Payments program. Before we get started, we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We also stand in solidarity with the ongoing protests against systemic racism and discrimination. The Business of Payments program is jointly organized by the Rotman School of Management and Payments Canada and has seen significant demand, which is a testament to the increasingly important and significant changes taking place in the Canadian and global economies as we move towards a more modernized payment system. The third and fourth offerings of our Business of Payments program are coming up this fall, each with virtual offerings in Toronto and Vancouver, each which have been contextualized for audiences in the respective markets. We are also excited to announce our new partnership with SFU-BD, Simon Fraser University, on the West Coast offering of the program. Please do reach out if you wish to learn more about these programs. We will also provide more information about these programs at the end of this webinar. We are thrilled today to have two leaders in the Canadian payments industry to provide us with their insights on the impact of COVID-19 on the way we pay, how prepared the payment system in Canada has been to accommodate these changes, and thoughts on the future of payments in Canada. I will also ask our panelists to comment on careers in payments, given the growth in the sector and its importance to the competitiveness of the Canadian economy. I want to remind everyone to use your chat box to send questions through. While I typically wait until the end of a webinar to ask a series of questions, if you send your questions through during the webinar, I'll try to integrate them into the flow of the conversation. Let me now introduce our speakers. Angela Brown is President and Chief Executive Officer of Moneris. She's responsible for continuing to build Moneris's leadership position in North America, strengthening its position in mobile payments, and expanding its strategic partnerships. Ms. Brown is an experienced executive with more than 25 years in the payments industry. Prior to Moneris, Ms. Brown was Group Executive, Enterprise Development, Merchants and Acceptance for MasterCard Worldwide. Ms. Brown started her payments career at CIBC, where she spent 13 years within the ATM, cards, and payments divisions. Currently, Ms. Brown serves on boards at Altus Group and ITAC, Information Technology Association of Canada, and was also recipient of the Electronic Transaction Association's 2015 Distinguished Payments Professionals Award. Ms. Brown holds an MBA from the Schulich School of Business and the ICD designation, having completed the Directors Program from the Institute for Corporate Directors. Tracey Black is President and CEO of Payments Canada. Building on the organization's past success, Tracey provides the leadership to define the next stage of Payments Canada's evolution, supporting the payments needs of Canadian consumers and businesses, and empowering a new era of modern payments. Prior to Tracey's appointment as President and CEO in March 2020, and since joining Payments Canada in November 2018, Tracey was the Executive Director of Modernization, responsible for leading the modernization of the Canadian core clearing and settlements payment infrastructure. Tracey held executive roles at TD and RBC and has consulted extensively in the financial services industry as an independent consultant with McKinsey & Company. Previously, Tracey was the president of GFH Group Incorporated, where her responsibilities included the launch of chip cards or smart cards in Canada. Tracey has more than 20 years of professional experience with extensive industry knowledge and deep expertise in payment strategy and innovation. I encourage everyone watching today who is interested in learning more about the Canadian payments system, please go to the Payments Canada website at payments.ca. It's full of very valuable and up-to-date information on the payments ecosystem in Canada. So now let's get started. Tracey and Angela, thank you both for agreeing to be part of this session, which will consider the impact of this global pandemic on the way we pay. perhaps I could begin with you, Angela. Moneris is one of, or perhaps the largest payments processors in the country. McKinsey has reported that over the first 2 months of this pandemic, we saw 5 years worth of digitization. So big changes occurred in such a short period of time. Since the onset of this pandemic, what patterns has Moneris seen in terms of the way Canadians are paying? And perhaps you can also say what you see the implications for the future of retail. Angela?
Sure. Thank you, and a pleasure to join you today. Certainly, we could watch week by week how Canadian consumers and the Canadian business climate changed as a result of COVID. And there was, of course, a sudden shift towards everyday spend in the early part of the crisis. And so there was a real peak in the types of spending that occurred and declines, obviously, in the more discretionary types of spending. And some of that has bounced back and some of that continues to be oppressed. You know, if it's in the entertainment or hospitality, restaurant sector, that's still down. But in the grocery, drugstore, oil and gas has bounced back. So, you know, you can look by category and see how Canadians were responding. There's something else that was already a big trend in Canada, and that was that Canadians were shifting their spending away from small business towards larger retail outlets. And of course, COVID really accelerated that. And so there's been a really big impact to small business that I think we're all aware of, but I don't think we've seen the full implications of at this time. So small business has really shifted. Absolutely, e-commerce shopping, you know, we all know people that never had done it before and they are doing it now. And so a huge shift in the volume growth in e-commerce. And what we talk about is digital shopping, because there's e-commerce, there's in-app types of payments, and all of these have been adopted much more aggressively. I think McKinsey is right on that there's been a huge acceleration in things we all were trying to make happen as well. And then the one other impact I would call out is in the way we work with customers and with each other, huge amounts of virtual collaboration. This is a great example. And it has changed the way we conduct our business, the way we engage with our customers, the way we enable them to access our services. And those are the big changes that we've seen so far. And it's only been, what, 3.5 months, really. So
yeah, who could have imagined the world would have changed so much so quickly? Tracey, you know, Payments Canada has done a lot of work on the decline of cash. So could you speak about the decline of cash sort of leading up to this, what we've seen during the pandemic? And as the lead at Payments Canada, maybe you can articulate to the audience your views or Payments Canada's views on what's a fully modernized payment system.
Sure. And again, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today. So I'll speak first to the decline in cash usage. And you're right, Waleed, every year now, Payments Canada publishes a study called the Canadian Payment Methods and Trends Study. We release it in December, and we have been observing a continual decline in cash usage at point of sale. This May, just as we were shortly into the COVID crisis, we also released a study, and that study was investigating how consumer behaviors had changed as a result of COVID. And the data that we received in that study demonstrated, you know, what Angela was saying, that, well, obviously, if people aren't going out, they aren't spending as much money, with a swing away from paper-based payments towards electronic payments. And also a preference to pay with contactless payment where that payment type is available. We also take a look at the data that we receive through our systems, and we can see that Canadians are visiting bank machines less, and when they visit, they take out less money than they did a year ago. So these are interesting trends, and I think the acceleration and the decline of cash is due in part to COVID and also measures that have been taken by the payments ecosystem to support the migration from paper-based payments to cash. Other digital payments options that have probably benefited would be things like e-transfer, which are vehicles that allow for people to exchange funds remotely and also not to have to exchange paper bills or checks. With regards to a fully modernized payment system, you're probably aware that we have a pretty significant modernization effort going on in Canada right now, where we're looking at our existing payment systems. So we've made modifications to our batch payment system. We're in the process of replacing our high value payment system, and we're introducing a real-time payment system. It's one of those, let's do everything at once kind of thing. There are two major components to the modernization effort. The first is payments infrastructure. So the actual hardware and the application, the technology of payments. The other part of the upgrade is the rules, which state who can have access to our systems and how those participants can use the payment systems. So we are upgrading both the infrastructure and our rules. And we're also introducing ISO 20022 messaging, which is a messaging standard that allows for payments related data to travel with the payment. And the provision of this payment information will support process efficiencies and allow for better data collection by Canadians and Canadian businesses. So all of those are pretty significant components of the modernization effort.
Yeah, and so we're going to get to more of those issues. But before I go to my next question, we just received a question from someone on the audience. And I think it's important to ask now because, Tracey, I did ask you about these long-term trends in cash usage. Angela, you also alluded to that, but we just got a question. How the decline of cash impacts those without formal employment, Indigenous communities, immigrants, and seniors. So sort of the equitable implications of the movement towards a decline in cash, move to a fully modernized payment system. Any thoughts on that? Maybe I'll start with you, Tracey, and then Angela, you could weigh in.
Sure. So I think the decline of cash has been driven by a couple of things. The first is that there are new payment options that end users perceive to be easier, lower cost, more convenient. Behaviors change because there's benefit to the users in the system. That said, there are still people who prefer to use cash, and those people prefer to use cash for the same reasons, because it's convenient, because they can access it. And I think there's also another component of anonymity. So one of the things about increases in digital or electronic payments is that there's more information about that payment and the people who are involved in that payment, or the entities that are involved in that payment. And that's not for everybody. Privacy is a big consideration as we look to payments. So as we modernize our payments infrastructure and our rules, and we see more innovation in the payments ecosystem, it'll be important to make sure that all Canadians are able to transact in all of the places that they'd like to. And so I think we will continue to see cash as a payment vehicle until we have a viable alternative that meets the needs of all Canadians.
Thank you. Angela, any thoughts on that?
I would just add that, obviously Moneris focuses on the digital space. We're not involved in cash transactions, but what we are still seeing is a real push towards making it accessible in more and more ways. So if you think of the evolution of electronic payments, starting with credit cards, and therefore a person had to qualify for a credit card, it's now evolving away from that towards debit cards. And as we can now see in certain parts of the world, there are QR codes, which are pretty low technology in terms of the scan that needs to happen, and different kinds of fobs that can enable electronic payments. It won't address some types of payment needs from some communities, but it certainly goes a long way towards making payment options more and more accessible to more people.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of a conversation for another day would be looking at those people that in the past didn't use digital payments and now have moved into that world, but we'll leave that for another day. Now I have a question to both of you. So we're not there yet, and by that I mean this vision of a fully modernized payment system that Tracey laid out, and that in and of itself is a moving target. So that would be changing. Mm-hmm. Perhaps you could indicate whether the Canadian payment system, from where you sit, was well prepared for this pretty large external shock that came with COVID. Tracey?
Sure. Why don't I start this off? I think Payments Canada systems are really in the center or the heart of the payments ecosystem. So our systems clear and settle payments. They are critically important to the economy in Canada, and they are designed to withstand all kinds of disasters, and it turns out even including pandemics like COVID. So throughout this whole crisis, our systems have performed exactly as we expected. We have seen record values going through our high value payment system over the course of the pandemic, driven largely by Bank of Canada activities. We all know that they've been very, very active in the economy. We've also, at Payments Canada, been able to operate 100% remotely. We don't have any employees on site. So thanks to our strong partnerships and our suppliers and our capabilities inside the organization, we've been able to have everybody at home, which is also important to make sure that we have the right capabilities available to us to run our payment system. So I think, we do regular tests. Critically important infrastructure is designed to be stress tested for volumes and crazy situations. And so I think we're well prepared. We were well prepared, and we continue to have no difficulties in operating our core systems.
Terrific. Angela?
Right, and just to put us into context, I would say that Moneris operates more at the front end of either the interface to business or the interface to the consumer, joining those two together. And we connect into all of the systems that Tracey just referenced and that were rock solid throughout this crisis. And I would say again that the Canadian market is very evolved when it comes to the ways that business and consumers like to pay. And so when you think of how Canada's progress towards contactless, so tap, whether it's tap of a phone or tap of a card, much further along than a lot of other countries, for example, the US. And so many of our Canadian businesses were already completely ready to switch to not only contactless, but switching from a $100 limit up to $250 limit, which really enables Canadians to continue to do the purchases they need without touching anything. And I think that's been extremely helpful. But also when you think about how available all these systems have been during a time when I can tell you that there was a big increase in e-commerce, yes, and a big increase in attempts at phishing and hacking and all of the security challenges that we expect to see on the digital side. Those got very active as well, and the Canadian system continues to really operate well. And there was retailers suddenly shifting from in-store to curbside delivery. They needed long-range wireless devices. They could get them. So lots of small changes, lots of larger changes, and the Canadian system, I think, responded extremely well.
Angela, you just answered a question that we just received. So I've done a lot of webinars in the last 4 months. I've never received so many questions so early. So you've got a really attentive audience, and I want to thank the audience for their engagement. But several people are asking if the payment system has seen an increase in fraud due to increased digital payments. And so you kind of alluded to that.
Yeah, certainly more attention. Yeah, go ahead, Tracey. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to, I guess maybe broaden the scope from just the clearing and settlement aspect of what Payments Canada does, and then the front end for the consumer, which is where Angela supports. And I think if we think about payments more broadly, and if you think about the process associated with some types of payments, what we have seen over the course of the pandemic is some pretty significant revision of process and innovation from the banks, for example, in terms of monitoring how their consumers are interacting with them, but also modifying how some of those payments are supported. And so the more digital we can make payments, in some cases, the less opportunity there is for paper-based payment fraud. One of the prime examples being checks. So you might imagine that with the introduction of the COVID benefits, there are a lot more checks or a lot more government payments that have been issued. And there was a real push from the industry to drive those payments to electronic channels. And if you think about the check payment, the check has to be printed on paper by people. It has to be put into an envelope. It has to be mailed. It has to be delivered by a person. Then it has to be opened and chances are pretty good it may have to be actually taken to the bank to be deposited if it's not a regular payment that consumer receives. Whereas if you register for direct deposit, you provide your account information, there's no chance of that payment going to anybody else except your account. So it's much faster, much more secure. And the money's in your hands as a recipient of the benefit much more quickly. So I think there was a real opportunity to highlight the benefits of some types of digital payments and to start to change consumer behavior and also processes to support digitization of paper-based payments.
Yeah, very important points to make. So Angela, did you want to add to that? Are you?
Yeah, I would just say that, you know, the digital payments business, the electronic payments business, already has a huge focus on the integrity of the system and the security of the system. And all of that just gets upped. All of that scrutiny and effort gets upped in an environment like COVID. So it's been busy, but I think it's also a great example of the robustness of the Canadian system and the Canadian players that they were able to withstand that kind of activity and deliver what business and consumers needed.
Okay, so I'm going to pivot now, but we're really moving to, away from cash towards an increasingly modernized payment system. There's lots of issues that come with this in terms of equity and security. It seems that the Canadian system, we're addressing all of these. And Tracey, your point about the stress testing, we got some emails about the stress testing that Payments does. The system was prepared for the big shock that we saw with COVID. Tracey, what role would innovation play in a fully modernized payment system? And let me be specific. Once we've achieved your vision of a fully modernized payment system, and as I said before, that in and of itself is a moving target, how does innovation fit in?
Well, innovation, in theory, is everywhere. From an infrastructure perspective, the investments that we're making in Canada to upgrade our infrastructure will provide us with payments, clearing, and settlement infrastructure that is, up to date, current, and able to support many different types of payments. Where the innovation piece really comes in is around the rule set that supports who can access those payment systems and how they can use it. So if we often describe our payment system like a road, so it's physical infrastructure, it's hardware and software, and then the rule set that supports that payment system says who can come on, what kind of cars can they drive, what lanes can they go in, how fast can they go. And so I think what we will see as we move forward is we will see the ability of new members of Payments Canada to access that payment system or multiple payment systems even. And we'll see enhancements to existing products in market and the introduction of new products in market, facilitated by upgraded infrastructure and also by an enhanced rule set.
Yeah, so maybe I could ask you, I'll come to you in a second, Angela, but Tracey, can you give a specific example of how rules support payments innovation? Is there a specific example that you could give us?
Sure. So I think we're going to be introducing a real-time payment system in Canada. There are a number of other countries that have real-time systems already, which is helpful for us because we can learn from those prior implementations. But if we think about the safety and security of the system, it's important. Authentication of the participants in a payments transaction that's important. And also because the money on a real-time system moves in near real time, everything has to happen in real time. So the rules would define what the minimum standards were for authenticating an end user. They would define how quickly a payment needs to move, sort of the outside limits, so no longer than, 10 seconds, for example. And they'll also define who can access the system. One of the things that we've been watching in the UK, for example, is the transaction cap on their real-time payment system. And as they've learned more about how their participants are using the system and they understand and are able to manage fraud around those types of transactions and the use cases that are making use of the system, they've been able to lift the transaction cap. So, I would expect you'd see something similar in Canada. We would launch with a transaction cap, say $25,000. And then as we understood more, we would increase it and increase it. And as that transaction cap gets higher and higher, the types of payments that can travel on that system, the use cases there are more and more use cases that are served by the higher transaction limits. So, we create sort of the parameters for the payments that can pass through the system, and then our members determine what the customer experience is around the capabilities of the system and the access components.
Yeah, great description, Tracey. Angela?
Yeah, I would say that the customer experience is where a lot of innovation will also happen. So once these rails or pipes are opened up and different types of payments can occur at real time, then the innovation is still going to be in the integration into the rest of a client's business. So small business, you've seen lots of specialty players that specialize in restaurants, or they specialize in hospitality, or now we're seeing specialization in terms of small micro payments. All of these types of payments require integration into the inventory management and the customer loyalty management and the operations of businesses. And so most people, or a lot of businesses today, are not looking for a standalone payment solution. They're looking for a fully integrated solution that helps them run their business and drive their business. And so the payments capabilities that we're establishing as a foundation for the Canadian economy start to get drawn into these other integrations and this ability to create more and more value for the end user.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a good segue into my next question. But before I go on, I mean, the audience, thank you so much for I've never seen anything like it. There's so many this doesn't fit right into what we're talking, or maybe it does. But just a question that we received from 3 different people about open banking, and can open banking be implemented without a modernized payment system? Who wants to take that?
I'll start.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
that's what I think.
Yeah. No, you need some key capabilities to make open banking possible. So open banking is really about providing broader access, and in order to facilitate the introduction of more participants in an ecosystem, you need technology that can support that. So I think if we think about open banking and new participants in the ecosystem, they have to be able to connect. So ideally you want a modern infrastructure that focuses on APIs so that connectivity is easy. But you also need the capabilities to do everything around that payment relatively quickly. And so open banking typically will require a real-time payment system, because you want to be able to validate the requester of a payment or the initiator of a payment. You want to fraud check that transaction in real time. You want to make sure that the funds are available. Because most open banking systems are push payments, which means the money is sent in real time. The payment occurs in seconds. And so that reduces the risk around the ability of the payor to receive the funds. So it's important that the infrastructure exists that allows for all of these moving parts to happen very, very quickly, and also the information that's required for the payments. So we couldn't introduce open banking very easily here on the systems that we have, just because connectivity is challenging, and we also need regulation that allows for broader participation in the ecosystem. Safety and security of payments are critical, and it's important that that framework that I talked about, the rules and the associated legislative components of the payment system, are all upgraded and modernized to support a concept like open banking.
Angela, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I would just add that it really builds, again, on the point I just made about integrating into other applications. Like, why would a consumer care about open banking? And it would be because it gives them information on a more timely basis that they can draw into other applications that they are using to enhance the way they analyze their overall financials, their overall investment plans, or the way that they're allocating resources. So there's some real benefits when there are the applications to use that open banking capability, and the innovation and the fintechs that are focused on the end user experience of open banking, I think, are going to be the reasons why consumers actually end up engaging and benefiting the most.
Angela, we just got a question for you. It even has your name in the question. And Angela mentioned the shift from small business to large online retailers. Are there any initiatives to help offset that shift?
Well, I'm going to take that as an invitation that I'm allowed to give a little bit of an advert for Moneris. So absolutely. What we have engaged in e-commerce and supporting our customers in e-commerce for years. But what this crisis made us realize that we have to be more than responding to the demand for e-commerce. We need to start to help small business get online. And so we've announced a package which helps the small business player who maybe doesn't even have a website to get a website built, who maybe has a website but doesn't have payments and a shopping cart integrated into it, and it enables them to do that. And I think that that push is we're going to continue to drive that. We're doing that in partnership as well with some of the partners we work with that are also very engaged in small business. And I think that's going to be a very important part of the future robustness of the small business community is going to be their ability to still maybe have a store on a block in a small town or wherever, but that they can actually reach a larger market by being online and do it in an affordable, safe way. And that's what our intention is with our own Moneris Online. But you know, you're going to see more offers like that around the whole country.
Would there be anything from a Payments Canada perspective, Tracey, that you would like to highlight?
I think you know, as it relates to end users picking the retailers where they choose to shop, there's not much that has to do with our core systems. I think it's important. I think small business is a really important component of our ecosystem, and I'm hoping that, you know, products like what Angela was describing will help to turn that tide. So
a question for you, Tracey. You know, Canada has a vibrant fintech scene, and there are many paytechs that have emerged. Perhaps you could help us understand what role paytechs are playing in helping modernize the Canadian payment space.
Sorry about that noise. I'm going to have to apologize. This is, you know, working from home scenario here. I believe what you asked me about was the role that paytechs will have in helping to modernize the payment system. Was that the question?
That's right.
Okay,
yeah.
Good. All right. So I think we are seeing lots of activity in the paytech ecosystem in Canada. We have some very innovative companies, and what we've seen more broadly from, you know, if we think about fintechs, the broader set of fintechs, and then the more specific set of paytechs, payments is a great place for innovation. And one of the things I think that lends itself to innovation is the fact that there are many, many steps in a payment. And so that creates an opportunity for a paytech to focus on a particular subset of that end-to-end flow, or a particular type of customer experience that they're looking to provide to end users to fill a gap that might exist. And so we see paytechs as being very, very versatile and drivers of innovation in payments now and going forward. And one of the things that we expect to see in Canada is broader access to our core payments infrastructure. So right now, all of the Payments Canada members are financial institutions that can connect directly to our payment system. And there's some legislation called the Retail Payments Oversight Framework that would allow for broader membership in Payments Canada systems, and therefore broader access to Payments Canada systems directly from non-financial institutions. And so the expectation then is that full end-to-end value chain will be available to participants that don't have access to it today, and that we will see innovation, and we will see development of new products and experiences, both for corporates and for consumers going forward. A lot of the innovation that we've seen in payments in Canada and around the globe has been focused on retail users. It's much more difficult to deliver the same level of innovation for corporate users because of the complexity of their systems, and their payment needs are different. And so our expectation and hope is that we will see much more innovation targeted at B2B payments or consumer to business, business to consumer payments than we've seen in the past with more open systems and the focus of Paytex.
Thank you for that. Angela, anything to say about the role of Paytex or fintechs more broadly?
I think they do tackle parts of the value chain. They're very creative. They come up with new ways to think about the process. Something simple like using your device to conduct payments instead of old-fashioned terminal. That came from a Paytech back in the day, and it's now very mainstream. And I think that's what Paytechs bring to the party. And then what the traditional players understand is how to manage the risk and the protection of those payments. And so there's often a partnership between the two.
Yeah. So I have a question for you. I'm just going to pivot a little bit more broad question. During one of the programs at Rotman, the Business of Payments programs, I put the following question to the room. And the question was, and this is a complicated question with lots of moving parts, but I just asked, where do you think Canada ranks in our payment system? Where 1 being the very, very best and 200 being the very, very worst. Where would you put Canada's payment system? And the answers surprised me. The first answer was 50th. And then someone else said, well, actually, that's too optimistic. Put us at 70th. But after a discussion, the consensus in the room was on the retail side, we're doing pretty well. We're top 10. But on the business side, it was more challenging. From where you sit, you could tell us what challenges are there to the payment systems that you see that you would like to help overcome that your customers are facing in each of the segments?
I think that the payments piece of it is really solid. And what we need to push digital payments in even further is to get to the digital credentials, the authentication of, are you who you said you are? Or do you have a right to access that account or accept those funds? And are those funds knowable in terms of where did they come from? Things that matter in the financial services segment, and that still have to be done in a somewhat either manual or just kind of old-fashioned way that I believe one day you will have a digital credential. You won't need plastic. You won't need a device necessarily. You will have some other way to authenticate yourself and reassure the entire system, whoever you're buying from and whatever financial services company you're using to store your funds, it will all be secure and understood and safe. And I think that's one of the biggest outstanding challenges that we still all share within the payments community.
Do you think that will come with payments modernization?
I think it'll be enabled. I'm going to let Tracey answer that for sure, but I would say as an optimist, it's going to be enabled because when payments can only handle the data that the infrastructure and the back office is geared to handle. And so, even if the front end, sorry about that, even though the front end may be able to handle that, all that information and authentication must travel all the way through to the back end in order to be complete.
Tracey, are you there? So I'm not sure what happened to Tracey. So just to come back to you, as a result of the movement, as a result of the COVID crisis, we saw a pretty quick reaction of all of the key players to move to direct deposit and movements away from checks. So in light of what you were just saying with the idea about a lot more data moving with every transaction, it has to be enabled. There seems to be an over-reliance on checks or paper-based payments in the Canadian space. Do you see that being addressed in the medium to longer term?
I'd first of all say that Canada is much further ahead than the US. That's a market where there's still a real attachment to paper-based payments and check payments. So I think Canada has done a lot of good things to move along from there. But I think especially in the commercial payment sector, in the business to business sector, there are a tremendous number of check-based payments still, and it's usually caught up in processes. It's caught up in either the information that needs to travel with that payment or has to be validated before the payment can be released, whether it's, does it match with the purchase order and the invoice? You know, there's tasks that are conducted by accounts receivable and payable teams that now, in order to be digital, the software must do it for them and create the trail, the audit trail, and the records and the reporting that's required. And so I think we're much further along, but I think that is an area where it's complicated, and there are many segments. It's not like you design one solution and all business will be happy. You know, there's large corporates, and there's players that are involved in very high volume, low value transactions, and then the reverse. And all of those folks will need different types of support and reporting and tracking and cross-checking that will require unique solutions.
So Tracey, we were just talking about the reliance in the Canadian payment space in the commercial side on paper-based payments, specifically checks. So in the conversations at Payments Canada, in your vision of a modernized payments, how close are we to getting over the tipping point, maybe moving away from that?
Well, I think checks are a little bit like cash in that, there are some people who really prefer them as a payment vehicle. I think from a modernization perspective, the digital ID is a component that will support innovation and also a lot of other things beyond payments. So we'll support innovation in the payment space, but we'll have an opportunity to see digital ID change the way we do lots of things in different areas. I think the introduction of ISO 20022 that's a big lift for us in the payment space. And so one of the things that causes business to hang on to checks, most of our checks in Canada are business checks. One of the things that causes those businesses to continue to prefer checks over other payment types is the information that travels with the payment. So with the introduction of Payment Canada systems that support 20022, and then suppliers and individual investments that need to be made by our members and their customers, as we see the ability to make use of the data that will travel with the payment, I think we will see new payment types, new payments experiences, and we'll also see a decreased usage of check, just because the data that can travel with an electronic payment is much greater than what can be printed on the piece of paper that you tear off the check before you deposit it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of technologies that will enable the movement of all of that data. If I may, I just received a series of questions, a lot of questions about implications for the unbanked charities. What is the future of charities? What's going to happen to all of these charities that rely on people putting, a $5 bill in the red kettle and so on? But kind of related, not really, but so when it comes to digital ID, is the federal government working towards providing that for Canadians? So those are two questions I have around the digital ID, which we've already talked about. What's the federal government's position? Are they working to achieve that? And sort of a second question, this impact on I know they're two separate questions. I'm sorry, they both came through at the same time, but on the unbanked and on charity. So Tracey, you take whatever one you want and leave the other one for Angela. How's that?
Okay, so why don't I start with your example about charities and things like that. And I think earlier in the call, Angela talked about QR codes. And so I think once we have a real-time payment system and a request to pay framework that allows for people to request payments from others, there's nothing that would prevent a charity from requesting money from people using a QR code or another capability where you could just scan that QR code with your phone and donate a fixed amount based on the creation of the QR code. So there are alternative methods of payments that will be supported by request to pay functionality and push payments that aren't maybe as difficult to implement as they have been in the past. So I think there is certainly a place for those types of things in a modern payment system. We just have to think about it. If you think about all of the modifications and the innovation that we've seen in deliveries and payment experiences over COVID, we will see that same kind of innovation as new capabilities come into market. And what seems to be challenging right now, I'm sure there are smart people that will figure out a way to improve the experience and create the access to modernized payments infrastructure.
Okay. Angela, you take the other set of questions.
Well, we've worked very closely with a number of charities who are also looking how do they solve their ability to capture small payments and anonymous payments, actually. I think there is going to be some real innovation in terms of tapping and basically enabling everyone to start to, whether it's tipping or whether it's putting that $5 into the collection plate, it allows them to do that in an easier way. I don't consider that necessarily solving the access problem for other communities that are disadvantaged. I am familiar from a past life that in other parts of the world, tremendous work's been done to enable large populations to get registered and to have a payments capability in order to receive government benefits. I think that there are some very creative solutions out there. I don't know what the Canadian government has engaged in to look at. I'm not involved in that as much, but I think that innovation is coming. It's going to enable the access. I think the foundations will be set by what Payments Canada is investing in. And then the charities themselves are also trying to solve these problems and make sure that there's a way that they can stay relevant in their holiday season campaigns and in the different ways that they use to collect their contributions.
Okay, terrific. So with 10 minutes left, I've got two big questions to put to both of you. And, we've had lots of roundtables with consulting firms, with banks, with payments processors, and so on. And one of the big challenges, which really was the genesis for the Business of Payments program at Rotman that Tracey and Payments Canada co-organized with us, co-run with us at the Rotman School. There's a real shortage of talent in this space around payments. And, Rotman and other schools have these MBA programs where people go out, they're highly skilled, but they don't have formal training in payments. What we're finding is many consulting firms will hire an MBA student or a commerce student, train them up to be sort of a payments expert, and then they get poached. So what are your thoughts? You like that, Tracey? But what are your thoughts on the state of talent? And by that, I mean shortages and in what areas, and what advice would you have for a lot of people listening to this webinar and attending our Business of Payments program about career paths within the payment space? So maybe, I got your attention there, Tracey. Maybe I'll come to you first.
Sure. I've worked in payments for almost 20 years. And, I've been a payments geek for a long time. And, I love the pace of payments. And that pace is just accelerating. And I think payments is attracting more and more people because the ecosystem that we call payments is getting broader and broader. But the flip side of payments is it's huge. Payments is huge. And the experience that I had coming through, I worked at a couple of banks on my way to Payments Canada, and there are people who are payments generalists who know a little bit about everything in payments, and then there are people who are deep specialists within certain types of payments. And within a large bank, you'll have your core banking, so your retail banking, which would be debit cards and ATM networks, and then you'll have your cards group, which would be primarily credit cards. You have your cash management people, you have your corporate payments. So you can see it can be quite siloed. And so there's lots of opportunities to go deep in payments. And I think what people are starting to realize is as we see innovation occur in the payment space, and we see more discussion about things like open banking, where people are looking to use infrastructure in different ways, those those silos are starting to come together more. And so I think the real value of a payments person is being able to see the bigger picture of payments and understanding what happens when you push in one place, what pops up somewhere else. And so it's complicated. It's, if you think about Payments Canada is in the middle of everything. So every payments in Canada ultimately passes through in some shape or form, passes through our infrastructure. But all the different channels that come into our infrastructure, they may never interact. And so I think it's great that consulting firms are training up consultants. I'm really excited that payments is cool, because it means that smart people are attracted to it, and the benefit of that is, I think, implicit. But I think payments is it's a great place to work, because there's so much going on, different channels, different experiences. We have a whole, we talked about this earlier, Waleed, we have a whole commercial space that is ripe for modernization and innovation. And we're seeing evolution and an introduction of new products in all different areas of payments. So there's a lot of things going on. And it's, I think it's a great future. I think someone who has a basic understanding of the payments ecosystem can determine in how many different areas they'd like to go deep, but understanding how the pieces fit together, I think that's sort of magic right now as evolution occurs, and being able to understand how innovation in one area will have an impact in another area of payments.
Yeah, so as a result of this payments program, and I could speak to the Rotman community, payments is cool, probably because of your influence at the Rotman School, Tracey, but so there's a lot of MBA students really asking to learn more about payments, and it is seeping into the core curriculum. But Angela, from where you sit, what are the challenges you're having with talent? Angela?
Yeah. Well, I would, all right, can you hear me? Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. I think if for those people that are just getting acquainted with the payment space, I think it'd be worthwhile to educate yourself on the value chain. So to Tracey's point, there are many different components and different types of payments. And what is fascinating is there is technology embedded in every single step along the way for payments, whether it's the upfront piece or whether it's the middle piece, the risk management, all of it requires technology. And so if you like technology and you also like its practical application, this is a great career, and people need to not be intimidated by technology. You don't all have to be engineers, but you have to be interested in and engaged in how to use technology to make that component of the value chain or that piece of the business that you're involved in better and better, from the most mundane thing to how the customer signs up to the most fascinating thing with how are algorithms used to enable detection of fraud and to identify and tokenize and protect transactions. Some of it very sophisticated, some of it quite simple, but it's really interesting.
Yeah, and so increasingly, I know as the academic director of the program, I'm receiving lots of inquiries from people interested in careers in payments. So my last question, and I'm going to give you each 30 seconds to give me an answer. And so this is sort of, in 10 or 15 years, you'll be taking a grandchild for an ice cream. And they're going to look up at you and ask you about this period of the pandemic. And then they're going to say, what was the one lesson for payments that you learned from this period? What would your answer be to this child?
I would say that overcoming manual stuff that we thought was so hard, it goes back to your opening comment about what McKinsey said, that we realized we could overcome a lot of obstacles that we thought were impossible to overcome, that we thought were embedded in human nature or the way that humans want to interact. And we've discovered very quickly that we are willing to transact remotely, we are willing to shop remotely, we are willing to authenticate in new ways remotely. And that it simply allowed us to drop some of our assumptions about what would be hard to change. and we changed very quickly. That's what I'm going to tell my grandchild.
Okay, so I'd like to answer that question like it's a year from now, in that I'm referring back to, and I would really like to be able to say, in payments for a long time, we had to trade off between convenience and security, and during the pandemic, we learned that you can have both.
Those are two great lessons, and what a great set of lessons to end this 1 hour. I can't believe an hour has passed already. I want to apologize to everyone on the call. I only got to about 10 questions, but there's about 60. But there is an opportunity for you to ask those questions by coming to the Business of Payments program. Angela, Tracey, thank you so much for, we know how incredibly busy you are. You both have, big responsibilities. Thank you for taking the time to be with us for this hour and to share your insights on these really, really important topics. And for those of you on the call that are interested in learning more about Rotman's Business of Payments program, including the one with SFU BD, there's information on the screen now. Jennifer Beal at BD and Sharon Dutman at Rotman. Feel free to reach out. So once again, Angela and Tracey, a huge round of virtual applause. Thank you so much. And everyone, be safe and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.